just a few moments. I'm going to give everyone another minute or two to get logged on. In the meantime, you can get situated and we'll start shortly. For folks just joining us, we're going to start in about 2 minutes, just giving everyone a second to get logged on and situated. We'll start in about 2 minutes. All right, as we're getting started, I'm going to launch a couple quick polls just to see who's in the room. The first thing, just to get everyone's temperature for the day, let's just see how are you feeling today? Go ahead and pick an answer. Give folks another minute. If you haven't answered the poll yet, go ahead and do so. All right, let's see the responses. So mostly been better, been worse. I can appreciate that. Although a few folks just really needed to be the weekend already. I can relate to that too. I feel like it's just one of those weeks. I feel very, just like tired, but that's okay. Awesome. So we're gonna do one more poll. And just let me know which one best describes you and what brings you here today. Take another second and vote in the poll. All right. Awesome. So I'll say most folks here are working in or running a mentoring program. So just trying to get a better sense of some best practices. That's a great place to be. Happy you're all here. And that's a good to know as we dig through. Awesome. So we'll dig into some of the content. The way this is going to work is I think I typically have this as about 90 minutes. At about the 45 minute mark, we'll take about a 5-minute break, just because that's just a lot of time for me to be talking and you to have to listen to me talking. But we'll dig in some content. As we go, if you have any questions, please feel free to stick it into the question box, which you should see on the bottom of your little like side panel. I'll try to keep tabs on those while we're talking, but we'll definitely leave time for questions at the end. So I might save some for then, and we'll see. I also invite you, after this is done, I'll put my email address into the chat at the bottom that you should receive it here. And I'll share it again at the end. And if you have any questions, definitely let us know. So a bit about me. My name is Jack Cavanaugh. I am our Director of Training and Program Development at Mentor New York. I've been with the agency for a little over 3 years now. My background is in social work, so I am a New York State licensed social worker. I've been working in youth programs for, it'll be 16 years in a couple weeks. That's after school programs, summer camps, mentoring programs, community centers, public, private, charter schools. You have experience in all of those different systems and settings. And so what we are, the perspective that I bring to this work is really talking about and centering a lot of the relationship building and the importance of relationship in a lot of this work. So again, if you do have any questions as we go, please let me know. We are a New York State, full statewide based organization. I am based in our office in Western New York, so I'm in Buffalo. The bulk of our team is in New York City, and we do serve programs across the entire state. Mentor New York is part of a national organization called Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. I'm going to try to share some resources and point you to a few places on both our and their website towards the end of this. And so you can also use that as an opportunity to learn a bit more about them. So Mentor, our national office, which is headquartered in Boston, what they do is a lot of sort of high-level research around best practices, a lot of work around, how do we start to make sure that mentoring is happening in a way that's thoughtful and intentional. And so we take all of that work that they do, all of that sort of thoughtfulness, research, and we bring it directly to people like yourselves who run or work at or mentor in mentoring programs. And try to make it as accessible as possible. And so that's what this is here today to talk about. How do we run a mentoring program? Looking at the best practices, the research, how do we start to put together a functional and high quality program? Most of what we're going to talk about today is from what's called the Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring. This is developed through our national office, our set of benchmarks and best practices for mentoring programs. Now, I think it's important to say this at the very beginning, but it's important to remember that mentoring or best practices does not mean, or the elements of effective practice themselves are not designed to mean that these are all the things you have to do if you want to run a good program. What they're designed to do is to say, we looked at the programs that have successful outcomes, and these are the things they tended to have in common. And so the more of them that you do, the more likely it is that you'll have positive outcomes. If there are reasons that you're not doing these, or that doesn't make sense for you based on your capacity, there should just be some reason why, or maybe your population or things like that. There are also addendums to the elements of effective practice for specific types of programs and populations. For example, for peer mentoring or group mentoring, for mentoring LGBTQ youth. I think there's one for STEM mentoring. All of these different supplements are also really great tools if you run programs that are targeted towards those. And again, I'll share with you where to find all of those towards the end. With all that said, let's start talking through some of the actual content today. So we're going to talk through 4 basic sections of today's program. The first one is program design. So if we're looking to start a program, or starting to start from the ground up with a program that already exists to kind of rethink and rebuild it, how do we then design it? Program management. So how do we take a program management plan? What types of steps do we do to make sure that we are tracking and making sure that we are controlling and managing the program as best as possible? Third, we have our day-to-day operations. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about evaluation. When we get into the program management and operations side, we're going to dive into the actual elements of effective practice. So the elements are divided into 6 sections. We have recruitment, screening, training, monitoring and support. I skipped one. Oh, recruitment, screening, training, matching, monitoring and support, closure. And I think of evaluations as sort of the unofficial 7th element of effective practice. So I pull it out as a little bit separate because it's not technically in there in the same way. But I think it's important to talk about. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about program evaluation and performance metrics at the end. As we're going, again, please put any questions that you have into the chat box. It's always more useful if we can do this in a way that is, as reflective and responsive to your programs as possible. So the more specific we can be, the more specific I can be for you, the better. So if there are things specific to your program, please do ask. So this is where I like to start with our mentoring logic pyramid. So we have to start at the top when we think about planning and designing our mentoring program. At the very top, we have successful outcomes for youth. That is the goal of every mentoring program. What those goals are, or what constitutes those goals, might look different in different settings, programs, populations. It could be academic, it could be self-esteem, it could be being able to learn specific skills around woodworking. I don't know, it could be any number of things, right? But we have some idea of our successful outcomes for youth. And at the end, we talk about evaluation. We'll talk a bit more about logic models and theories of change, think more about what those outcomes should be. But for now, we'll just say successful outcomes is the top of the pyramid. Before we can have successful outcomes for youth, we want to make sure we have long-lasting matches. Now, I will say a lot of research has shown us that the length of the match is really critical in being very formative into the depth of our outcomes, right? It's one of the single biggest factors in terms of strong outcomes versus not, is how long are they matched together. I do think it's possible to have good programs with good outcomes with lower amount of times in the match. So most of the research kind of has found a sweet spot of at least like 12 to 18 months in relationship with each other. I do think it's important to take some of the research around some of mentoring and some of these with a bit of a grain of salt, only because, as with any sort of research, we are beholden to the data that exists. And in a lot of ways, most of the data around mentoring that's been collected is really skewed towards one-to-one, community-based mentoring programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters, and which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that those are very large programs that have been around for a while, so they have larger pools of data, and so they're going to be able to show stronger outcomes. So long-lasting matches has been pretty consistently shown to be a very important tracker for outcomes. That said, one way I think to think about it is if you think about like imagine like a bowl, right, or a cup. If you have something that's long and kind of shallow, it's going to hold a certain amount of water. And if you make something that's shorter and deeper, it's going to hold the same amount of water. And I think it's a similar kind of dynamic, right? If we think about long-lasting matches, that can be really important. But if we want to do shorter term programs, say over a summer or a few weeks or whatever it is, then we need to make sure that the relationship is much more intensive off the bat, right? We're digging deeper, we're having more structured curriculum, and we're providing that depth because we don't have the luxury of the length. And so at the end of the day, we're still filling up that cup the same amount of water, right? We're still doing the same amount of work. It just requires a much more intentional, in-depth approach to it if we want to do it over a shorter period of time. So, but we want to have long-lasting or successful in-depth matches. And so in order to do that, we want to have screened, trained, and supervised mentors, right? We want to make sure that whoever we're putting in touch with these young people have been adequately screened, adequately trained, and are provided adequate supervision. But in order for us to be able to do that at all, we have to make sure that we have trained staff to do the screening, do the training, and do the supervision, right? Someone has to be doing these things, and they have to know what they're doing. And in order for them to be trained and feel confident they know what they're doing, there needs to be some kind of program management plan. because we need to be able to coach the staff on what they're doing in a way that is, we need to have a plan that tells them what they need to be looking for when they're screening and training these mentors. What kind of questions should they be asking? What sort of red flags should they be looking for? And all of these things are going to vary depending on your population, your program structure, all these different pieces. And so before we can have that in place, we need to make sure that our mentoring model and the program design that we're doing addresses our population's needs. And so thinking about for yourself, what type of program am I starting? What type of population am I serving? What do I need to be able to do to make sure that the population that I have is being served in the way that I want? At the end of the day, you are the expert of your community, of who you're trying to serve. And so you need to make sure that, and we can help you talk through this and think through this, but that you have a model that addresses the population that you want to serve that is going to be successful for them. And no two programs are going to be exactly alike because different communities, different populations have different needs. But again, before we can get to that, we have to start with our mission statement. I think it's important to think about mission statements, and we're going to talk about them in a second. And I think it's important to separate them from if you maybe work at part of a larger nonprofit organization that has an organizational mission statement. I think it's still important to think through, what is it that my program is doing? What is my program's mission? You want to be able to have that sort of centering piece, that North Star that helps guide you and helps inform all the rest of these steps all the way up to those successful outcomes, including identifying what are those successful outcomes. Now, when we talk about mentoring, I think it's important to use a shared definition. And so this is typically the definition that we'll use when we're doing some of these trainings, but that mentoring is a structured and trusting relationship that brings young people together with caring individuals who offer guidance, support, and encouragement aimed at developing the competence and character of the mentee. So there's a few things in here that I want to kind of pull out. The first one is that it's a structured and trusting relationship. Structure doesn't necessarily mean that it has an organizational structure or it's part of a formal program. Mentoring happens to all of us in our lives through relationships that we build with people at work, in our communities, various spaces and settings that we move through. And so mentoring doesn't have to happen in the confines of a formal matched mentoring program. But there is some sense of structure, right? There is some sense of intention in what's happening, that we are working and developing them towards our mentees towards a goal or towards their own sort of development. And then it's a trusting relationship. The trust is so critical because the foundations of the relationship are just so critical to building anything that we want to build from there. Any other successful outcomes, whether that's, again, academic, social, emotional, skill-based, employment-based, whatever it is only going to be possible if we take that time at the beginning to build that relationship over time and build that trusting, caring relationship. It also says bring young people together with caring individuals. That doesn't say caring adults or people that are 20 years older than them. There's lots of great mentors who are peer mentors or near peer mentors. And ultimately that it's aimed at developing the competence and character of the mentee, that it's about the mentee. Relationships and mentoring relationships are no different, are always a two-way street. It's happening both ways. And mentors obviously are going to grow tremendously as part of their engagement in any type of mentoring relationship. But we want to make sure that as we're designing and talking about the program and working our way through it, that we are keeping it focused and aimed at the mentee's development. So a couple of basic considerations for program design. First is the population. Who is your population going to serve? Who's your program going to serve? This could be demographic information. It could be specific communities and neighborhoods, geographic areas. It could be young people who are interested in a particular topic or study. It could be any number of things like that. Second, you want to consider site-based and community-based. They're pretty much exactly what they sound like. Community-based mentoring is out in the community. They meet on their own. So Big Brothers, Big Sisters, for example, would be an example of community-based mentoring, right? So you have mentors and mentees. They go out in the community on their own time. They schedule their times together. They go out and do things. Site-based mentoring is, again, exactly what it sounds like. It happens at a site. So it could be a school. It could be an after-school program. It could be at a community center. But it happens at a specific site. So say we meet at the community center on Saturdays from 1 to 4, and that's when mentoring happens. And everyone who's part of the program comes together. They might still pair off in their matches while everyone's there, but it's all happening in the confines of that sort of defined space, both in terms of time and geography. And lastly, your program model. One thing to consider is, again, I talked about this before, but that matched and unmatched mentoring. Mentoring happens in whether or not we're in the confines of these formalized relationships. So if your program kind of exists more in that sort of unmatched mentoring, so that's about like after school programs or sports programs, we have coaches that are mentors, or any number of things like that, where it's not this sort of formalized matched mentoring initiative. That's okay. A lot of this is still going to apply to you. But just keep in mind, it can be a little bit different when we're talking about some of these things. Obviously, if we're talking about matching and things like that, but it's a subtle distinction to kind of keep in mind. But both are very powerful and effective ways to influence young people. But thinking about the different models, we have that sort of traditional one-to-one mentoring, what most people think of when they think of mentoring. You have a mentor and a mentee, they're matched together, they meet one-on-one. You can also have group mentoring. Typically, we say to keep that to about one adult or one mentor for about 3 to 5 young people. Once you get above that, you end up doing a lot more behavior management, classroom management type things, and less really mentoring and relationship focused work. And so that typically is much less, you're really not getting a lot of depth because you're not really able to dig past the surface because so much of it is just controlling what's happening. Team mentoring is similar to group, but instead of having you keep the same sort of ratio, like one, mentor to 3 to 5 mentees, but instead you could have 2 or 3 mentors matched with 10 to 15 mentees. This is pretty common in sort of summer camp, after school type programs. So like Boys and Girls Clubs will use this a lot, and it can be really effective as well. Peer mentoring, exactly what it sounds like, as well as virtual mentoring. Both peer and or virtual mentoring can be traditional group, team, site-based, community-based. So it's a little bit of a different sort of set of categories, but it's a different way to start to think about your program and your model that makes the most sense for your population. Does doing things virtually make most sense? Does doing things with a peer sort of lens make the most sense? And as we go on, we'll talk more about how things virtually might change, doing programming virtually might change some of the way we do work mentoring. A lot of the stuff as we talk through this is going to be is not very different in terms of doing programs, virtually or not. But we'll pull out a few specific differences that have changed over the past few years as more programs have done their work online. When you're identifying your kind of best population, this is supposed to be like a bell curve. I'm not a graphic designer, but it's important to think too about what is mentoring and who is mentoring best designed to serve. On one end of the spectrum, you have in the bell curve, you have sort of really deeply challenged students. These are young people who are dealing with very, very complex needs, mental health concerns, homelessness, drug addiction in the home, things like that. In the middle, the biggest part of the bell curve, you have a lot of the bulk of young people that you're going to end up dealing with, or that exist, I guess. And the other side, you have these sort of successful young people that are going to be able to achieve some of these outcomes without the intervention of a mentoring program. And what happens is, in a lot of spaces, especially when we talk to schools or after school programs, they'll identify the students kind of at one end of the spectrum as who they're trying to intervene with, whether that's intentional or not. But they tend to be the students they know the best, right? Because either the ones who kind of know how to self-advocate and take, aim at spaces and walking through those spaces and with confidence, and they get to know them, or the students who are very high need. But the reality of mentoring as an intervention is it's most effective when it's those students somewhere in the middle that are not struggling so deeply that they need professional support from social workers or case managers or whatever else, but they're not able to necessarily navigate with the same level of confidence and social capital as students who might be able to do that successfully. And so we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about recruiting mentees. But when you're thinking about who your program is serving, it's important to have a very sort of specific idea of who it is that you're looking for. I was talking to a program that was recruiting with schools, and they would go to these school partners and try to recruit young people through those students. And they would talk to the school social workers and school counselors. And, they would say, hey, we have a mentoring program. We're looking for 7th grade students who you think could really benefit from being part of a mentoring program. And most of the students they would get would either be these really deeply challenged students that were too high need for the mentoring program to really be able to successfully support, or they were students who had a lot of social capital, had a lot of resources in their lives that maybe would have hit those successful outcomes regardless of whether they were participating in this mentoring program or not. Because again, in a lot of schools, if you worked in a school, you know this, and I know in my experience of working in schools, it's definitely been this, that those are the students I most interact with, right? They're the students who either self-advocate and come get to know me, or they're the ones who have really high needs that they need me to come in and really work with them. So what we did with this program is we said to them, no, make a very clear mentoring profile of who it is that you're trying to look for. So they went back to the school and were able to say, we're looking for 7th grade students, particularly young women who might struggle socially with making friends, but seem to have some aptitude for science. We want to do some STEM activities. And that was a much more specific ask, and they were able to find students that fit their program, and they had improved outcomes because they were able to really articulate what type of students and young people they were looking for. And so as we think about mentee recruitment, I think it's really helpful to really focus in on what is it that we want to be able to do and what young people are we going to be able to support. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the mission statement. When we do this in person, we'll spend a bit more time on this. I'm just going to pull the whole slide up and we can kind of talk through it quickly. But I think it's important to think about a mission statement for a few reasons and really set the tone for this. The first one is obviously funding. If you're applying for grants, they want to know your mission statement. If you're part of a larger nonprofit organization, as many mentoring programs are, like they're one program that's part of a larger organization, you're going to have an organizational mission statement you're going to put on those. And so you don't necessarily need a program specific one for funding. But I think it can help with the second two. The second one is to generate interest and help you communicate and talk about your program. Having a really clear one sentence idea of this is our program's mission, this is why we exist, and this is what we want to do is really, really helpful in helping other people understand what it is that your program is about. Whether those are people you're asking for money or for volunteers or advocate for your program in the community, whatever it is, that communication is going to be much simpler. The third one is to focus and energize those involved, right? So that's that sort of centering piece, that North Star. Like our program is designed to do, X, Y, and Z. So Mentor New York, as our organization, we exist to improve the quality and quantity of mentoring relationships across New York State. And so it's a very concise way to say, this is what we do, this is what we're about. And also helps drive our programming. If we're going to move in a certain direction and launch a program or move in a different direction, we want to make sure, okay, is this helping us improve and fuel the quality and quantity of relationships across New York State? If yes, great, let's do it. If not, no, maybe we need to reassess where we're coming from. There's lots of great resources around developing mission statements online. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but please do feel free to dig into that. If you have specific questions, follow up with me afterwards and we could talk more. But let's talk about program management. A lot of this is about how we manage information and develop the programming. Programs need a system for managing information for a few reasons. One, to evaluate program efficacy, where it's really hard for us to evaluate if our program is reaching those outcomes that we claim that our program is doing if we're not tracking information about our matches. Well, again, we'll talk more about this at the end around evaluation, but there's surveys, tools, data collection, whatever tool we're doing, we have to be collecting and storing it somewhere. Second, maintaining statistics for our grantors and funders. If people are giving us money, typically they want to know what type of work are we doing. Some funders have much more specific asks than others, and that's okay. And so some of it you want to make sure is responsive to what you're being asked to do by those who are funding you. And finally, risk and liability. We really want to make sure that as we're talking through, mentoring programs are putting young people in close contact with adults, there's a certain level of risk and liability that comes with that. There are lots of ways to mitigate that risk and liability, and we're going to talk about that when we get through, especially talking about screening and supervision, but it's never able to bring that directly to zero. And so the more information that we're putting in storage, we're having documentation around all of our matches, their activities, who's doing what, who went through what training, how often are we meeting with them to provide supervision, all of these things. We want to make sure there's some record in there. Some other information you might want to record besides just that kind of program information is also all of your program operations. You want to make sure that as much as you can, that if you're running this program and you fell off the face of the earth tomorrow, that someone else could come in and read your documentation and kind of pick up and get things going as quickly as possible. Same with any match information, right? Those mentors, those mentees, who's matched together, notes about their meetings, how often are you checking in with them, all that kind of thing, as well as any financial information. It's really important to keep really tight records of, for I think obvious reasons. A few other things about just risk and liability. So risk is the uncertainty about a future event that directly or indirectly threatens your ability to accomplish your mission. Risk management, it's a discipline or system for managing that risk. So what can we do to prevent incidents or minimize losses after that incident? How do we resolve things? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This is not my particular area of expertise. I do like to point people to the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. They're a really, really great resource. I'm going to put their link here into the chat. I've been on a few webinars that they've done. They have some really, really valuable resources, and they really do a good job of making it accessible. But their website is nonprofitrisk.org. But we'll talk more about what that looks like in terms of our program operations side when we get to screening. So let's talk about program operations. So this is going to be the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. These are those elements of effective practice. We have our recruitment, screening, training, matching, supervision, and I guess closure got cut off, but the final one is closure. And then again, evaluation as the sort of unofficial, best practice or elements of effective practice. So let's talk about recruitment. So first is recruitment. Recruitment is the place to start because without the people that you want to be your mentors and mentees, you can't really run much of a program. When we're talking about recruitment, I think most of the time we end up talking about mentor recruitment because it's more difficult and we have to be more intentional and thoughtful about it. But we want to make sure we're not losing sight of how important it is to think about, how are we recruiting and bringing together our mentees. And so some really basic questions we want to ask ourselves is to define our audience, right? Who are the mentees? Who are our mentors? What types of demographics do they have in place? What interests and hobbies, challenges and barriers? And this is where those profiles really start to come in handy. If we have a profile of who our target mentors and mentees are, it's going to be that much easier for us to be able to locate where they're coming from. If we know that our mentors are, we want people with certain areas of expertise or interests in, I don't know, woodworking, then we can find places and communities that might cater to people with those interests, or same with like arts or whatever it is. And same with our mentees. And also thinking about what specific challenges and barriers are our mentees facing, and how can we find mentees who might have lived experience that can specifically talk about those challenges and barriers that they are dealing with. So a couple questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about how to develop recruitment, again, particularly for mentors. Who has a vested interest in the interests of your mentees or in the futures of your mentees? Who is out there who has that sort of, just sort of natural interest and investment in what's going to happen with them? That could be people from their community. It could be people who work at their school. It could be, we worked with one program that they used small business owners from the community around a school where they were mentoring. It could be a local company that does a lot of investment and community work in that neighborhood. One program I worked with was a youth arts focused program that was actually based in a building that also doubled as like artist, like loft housing. And so they had a lot of artists already in the same building as them. And so it was, again, a natural pool of mentors that they could tap into. So once you have that who, where are they located? Where might you find them? If you're just looking for people who, you know, might have experience working with youth or interest, then maybe we'll look at retired teachers or, you know, things like that if you want to work with college students. And then we have the how. How are you going to communicate with them? What method of engagement are you going to use to get the message to them? So once you've identified the who and the where, then you can start putting together strategies of outreach. There's two sort of approaches. Actually, I think I might have a slide on this in a second, but I'll talk about it now anyway, because this is a good segue. But two sort of broad approaches to recruitment that we'll talk about a lot. The first is what we call sort of warm body recruitment. So this means, you know, going to a community event or the library and sitting at a table with the sign-up sheet information, just trying to get as many people to sign up as possible, or putting on ads online, like on Facebook, and boosting those out as much as possible, and just really focusing on just getting a high amount of numbers. The problem with that is you spend a lot of time weeding through a ton of names, typically with pretty low payoff. You're not going to get a ton of mentors who make it from sign up to actually being part of your program, and it takes a lot of time. By doing a more targeted approach like this, you're able to really work more efficiently because your attrition rate as you move through the screening and recruitment process, right, they do application and interview and all of these different things, there's going to be more retention from step to step because you've really thought it out from the beginning that these are people who are probably going to persist because they have this sort of vested and real interest. So what are some characteristics of a good mentor that you might want to look for? They're generally patient, flexible, active listeners. They're good role models, have some type of positive attitude, have a personal interest in the relationship, value diversity, they're non-judgmental, they're genuine and honest, resourceful, and inspiring. All of these are just characteristics that you want to think about as you're trying to develop those profiles for what type of mentor do we want to be looking for. So again, we have warm body recruitment, large number of volunteers in a short time period, just trying to get as many names as possible, not really worried about qualifications. And then you have targeted recruitment, smaller audience, specific skills, or characteristics that might not be found, you know, in the general population that you really want to target in and look for. Typically, if a program is having trouble with recruitment, I'll give them one of two pieces of advice and tend to be pretty successful. The first one is that the best recruiters that you're going to be able to ever use are your existing mentors. So people that you have already in your program. So have those conversations with your mentors. So you can say, I want you to go out and, you know, help us recruit, because they are going to be the most convincing people about why it's great to be part of your program. It's one thing to hear it from staff or something like that. It's a completely different thing to hear it from someone who's mentoring themselves, right? We want to make sure that the messenger is as powerful and informative as possible, and current mentors are just going to be the best of the best at that. The second piece is, you know, find other people in the community that you might be able to deputize to help you find mentors. And another way to do that is through institutional relationships. So if there's a local church or a local business that you can find someone who's like the pastor at a church or HR person at a local company, right? And you're able to work and build a relationship with them, and they're going to be able to find you 5 or 6 mentors from their pool of people. You recruited one person, but that person then turns into 5 or 6. And it's a much more efficient use of your time to build those types of institutional relationships. Plus, you're building them onto a cycle. So hopefully you can get a handful of mentors from this pool every year. And so the more you're able to do that and find these pockets of places where mentors are coming from, the more it'll sort of self-perpetuate, and you'll spend less time having to worry about recruitment. This is a great tool that I really value and think is really useful for programs to think about with recruitment. I encourage you to use this. You can find examples of this online, but the idea is that it's a recruitment map. So it's a very concrete way to begin thinking through, how do I want to start my recruitment campaign? So you can draw this with me if you want, or we'll just talk through it. But the first thing we're going to do is start by drawing 3 circles like this on a piece of paper, or on a computer. In the smallest circle, you want to think about who are people that you know personally. Who are people that are in your direct network? People that you can reach out to, people that you can call, people that you can tap into to either mentor, maybe volunteer themselves, or open doors to other people. When you think about that in the second circle, then you end up with who are those people that are people that you could be affiliated with, or other kind of collateral organizations. So these might be professional groups that you're a part of, alumni association, different places like that might be able to help you do some of your recruitment through them, because you already have some way of tapping into that network. And then finally, you have that sort of greater community at large. So local businesses, additional community organizations, things like that. So by starting with the places that you have the closest connections with before moving your way out to the sort of cold recruitment of just calling up different companies or community organizations or whatever it is that you might not have a connection to, you're going to be able to be more successful to start with by working through those places that you have a direct connection with. And you can work with your mentors to develop ways of doing this themselves. As they go through the process and you're talking to them about being part of the recruitment process, then you can make sure that they are able to focus in on finding people that exist in their sort of circles and developing a strategic plan for them as well. So that's recruitment. What we're going to do now is take about a 5-minute break so we can go use restrooms. I'm going to fill up my water bottle, and then we'll circle back here about 5 minutes. During that 5 minutes, if you also want to spend some time thinking through that recruitment and what type of things you'd be looking for, that's a great time to do that, as well as type in any questions that you may have had so far into the question box, and I can take a look when we get back. So I'm going to put this timer up, and when it gets down to 0, we'll start back again. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you're able to fill up any water or use the restroom or stretch your legs. We're going to dive right back in. I don't see any questions in the box, but if anything does come up, then I'll keep it open. But for now, we'll just keep working through. So we're going to talk about screening. Now, I think it's important to think about screening in two ways. The first one is that specifically we're going to be talking about screening for volunteer mentors, particularly in New York State. If you are in a different state or if you're using paid mentors, there are a lot of different rules around what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. So if either of those apply to you, then take what we're going to be talking about a bit here with a bit of a grain of salt, although a lot of it is still relevant. For better or for worse, at least in New York, mentoring exists in a very gray space in terms of oversight regulation. And so because of that, there's not a lot of control over, out of a government perspective, mentoring programs and things like that. But I say that to say that when we're talking about it, we say no one has a legal right to be a volunteer. There are not the same sort of protections that come in play when we're talking about people who are looking for employment or dealing with employment law. Volunteers, that stuff just doesn't really exist. And so it's important to say that, and then also that every interaction is an opportunity to evaluate a volunteer's appropriateness. Sometimes I think I'll talk to programs who think of screening as like a toll booth or a gate, right? That they come, there's a gate, they say yes or no. Once they're through, they're through. But that's not really how it works. Screening starts at the moment you start recruiting them, and it keeps happening even once they're matched and you're providing supervision. And we're going to talk more about some of that when we get to the supervision and monitoring stage. But screening happens throughout that entire process. Every time you're talking to them when they're in training, or you're providing feedback, even if they've been matched for like 3 months, these are all opportunities for you to say, like, you know what, these red flags are not going away, and this is something that we need to consider. Maybe they're not a good fit for this program, and that's okay. I think of screening, again, not as a gate, but as a series of progressively kind of finer nets, right, with smaller holes. So the first net has the big holes, but it gets rid of the big fish, right? That's your sort of background check process, references, your interview application. You're going to weed out a lot of the really big red flags there. And this is where it really starts. As you move through and do training and talk up through supervision, you're going to get those kind of finer mesh screens that are going to filter out, not people who are going to come in and try to use your program as a way to get access and harm children, but people who just might not understand boundaries as well, or having a tough time, not really hearing feedback, or pushing the limits a little bit. And those are things that you're going to want to watch out for more later. At a very basic level, your program should have these 4 things: application, a written application, some type of interview process, some type of background check, and some type of references. How in-depth and how much you want to dig deep on any of these 4 is going to depend a little bit on your program, but you want to make sure there's some type of these 4 things in place. A couple other, and we're going to talk more in detail about them in a second, but a couple other tools you want to consider might be a home visit, especially if your program is a community-based where they might be going to the mentor's home, then you're going to want to see that home. If they're not going to the home, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. Another thing to consider as well is other people who are living in the home, doing background checks on them, things like that. Dmv checks, of course, if a program allows mentors to drive mentees, you're going to want to do some kind of Dmv check. Even if not, it can be a really great way just to kind of get a sense for someone if they have 40 speeding tickets over like 3 years on the same stretch of road. That's a red flag, not necessarily because of their driving ability, but because they clearly are not someone who learns from, doesn't think the rules apply to them, right? Then we also have our sex offender registry. If you're doing background checks, it's going to also search this, but some programs will still spend some time spending time searching through the sex offender registry. When we think about screening, we want to approach it from this perspective, right? Effective screening reduces risk. And so identifying those who would create unacceptable risk given unsupervised access to youth. So that could be people, again, who are really looking for those, they're the predators who are looking to find access to unsupervised young people. And, doing background checks, interviews, that type of thing is really going to help weed out the major red flags. You're also going to have to screen to prevent placement of individuals who lack the time, judgment, or necessary skills and attitudes to be a mentor. A great interview question or application question that you should ask every mentor is just, why do you want to do this? And if they start talking about how they want to, be this kid's savior and change their life and whatever, that's going to be a bit of a red flag, right? Because that's not the healthy approach to mentoring. Some of that can be coachable, if you provide them a lot of training and support to kind of shift their mentality. But if someone's really dead set and that's their approach, then that might not be someone you want to be part of your program. All of this helps reduce liability exposure, right? You have a system in place, you're doing your screening, you're doing your application, your interview, your background check, you're checking references. You're not going to be able to stop everybody, but if you have a consistent process and a consistent system, then you're going to be able to do dig a lot deeper into being able to say you did what you could do to stop any harm from coming to this young person. And if something does happen, it can help minimize your organizational's liability. And then obviously ruling out potentially dangerous individuals with a history of violent or exploitative behavior. If you're running a background check and there's convictions of harm against children in their past, then that's obviously not someone you want to have part of your program. Of course, with background checks, depending on what kind of information you get back, things like that, having some type of involvement in the criminal justice system is not in and of itself a disqualifying factor for any mentor. And you have to think a bit about your program and sort of your population and any other, policies that organization may be part of has in place. So for example, I know some school districts do have policies that anyone with any kind of criminal record cannot volunteer in the school building. Other places, other nonprofits, community centers don't have to be quite so strict. In programs that I've worked with, I don't feel like if someone has a nonviolent drug offense from 1996, that they had like a marijuana possession, that should not disqualify anyone from mentoring. And in fact, a lot of times those are the people who have some type of involvement in criminal justice when they were younger, who you want to have mentoring and speaking to that experience and what their own sort of life was like. The other part of the reality is that, as we kind of move into 2021, over the past, 30, 40 years, for a lot of young men of color who have been arrested and involved in the incarcerated over that time because of war on drugs and its overlay with a lot of sort of institutional racism in our policing systems and things like that, that there are a lot of now adult men who have some of those drug offenses from a long time ago. And if we are excluding people from mentoring based exclusively on that, then we know we're disproportionately excluding men of color from mentoring as part of our programs. And then what happens is that we get calls all the time from programs struggling to recruit men of color, but they, aren't approaching it from a perspective of being trauma-informed and culturally competent. And so keeping that in mind as we're talking through our screening practices and how we approach background checks. Some other things you might want to screen to think about: how a mentor is going to deal with adversity, manage conflict, manage their time and solve problems. How do they approach communication? How do they manage stress? How they adapt to new situations, and all sorts of other specific things that you might want to know. And so ultimately, I think about this in two sort of ways: that we're both screening for safety, right? That's that background check, the interviewing, making sure they understand boundaries, all of those types of things. We want to make sure that they are a safe person to put in touch with your mentees. And then we're also screening for suitability. Is this someone who's just suitable? They might be safe, but do they have the temperament, the experience, the personality to be a mentor, specifically with your program, with your young people, with your population? They could be an awesome person who really just wants to do well, but you just know after interviewing them, this is not a person who's going to be successful with your population, or they don't have necessarily the time commitment to commit to the program, even though they might think they do, things like that. And so you're screening for safety and suitability. And so you take all of these different screening tools. So you have your written materials, you have external documentation, your own impressions from interviewing them, consultation with other staff, your own observations while you're going through this process, and your informed intuition that you develop over time of doing this. And you have to weigh all of these different things before coming to a final decision. Outside of obviously something on the background check that was, so maybe some type of violent offense or harm towards children in their past, those are going to be, disqualifying. But there aren't very many things for most folks who are applying to mentoring programs that in and of themselves will disqualify. You also have to think about what is your ability to provide adequate training and support to them to help them maybe get to a place of being more suitable. Do you have the capacity and the infrastructure to be able to do that, or do you not? And so, if someone might be really struggling with, maybe they're coming in with that savior mentality or something like that, and you feel like, what, I think with enough training and support, we can kind of get them past because they seem like a really good addition. That's awesome. But you might also say, what, we just don't have the time and energy and staffing to commit to getting this person where they need to go, and we just can't do that right now, and that's okay too. So once you've recruited and screened them, then we got to train them. So some basic training things you want to consider. You want to go over the program guideline. You want to talk about the matching process. Again, with all of this is going to be true for mentees as well. We don't worry too much about screening mentees in the same way, because typically most of what you're going to be looking for is going to happen in the kind of the recruitment phase. I will say that when you're screening mentees, you just want to make sure that it's more that suitability piece. Like, you just want to make sure that these are the mentees that you want a part of your program, or they can commit the time. Do they need to have the support of family for transportation? Things like that. You want to make sure they're suitable. With training for mentees, most of this is going to be the same, right? They want to explain their program guideline. You want to make sure the matching process is clear. You want people to understand what they're really getting themselves into, what the timeline is, things like that. For mentors, you want to make sure you're talking through skills. One of the biggest pieces of feedback that we used to get from mentors after we would develop mentor trainings and deliver them was that, they would go through this training and it was all well and good. They learned a lot about active listening and boundaries and all these different pieces. But that, when it came down to it, they had to show up to their program. They had to sit here. Their mentee was sitting there, and they had to have a conversation. And they still just didn't really feel equipped to have that conversation, how to do that. And so making sure your training really talks through, those mentor skills, like how do we do engagement? How do we have conversations? How do we really engage and build those relationships? What are some sort of natural stages of development, for them? Are you working with, middle school students, high school, elementary school, college students, whoever it is? What is sort of the normal stage of development or behavior that they're at that point? We want to talk about issues of diversity, cultural competence, cultural humility, cross-cultural communication. All of those pieces are going to be really important. Most mentoring programs have a predominantly white mentor pool with a mentee pool that is predominantly young people of color. It's not a bad thing, it just is what it is. And so we want to make sure that, we're having those trainings with our mentors and how to navigate those types of relationships in a way that's thoughtful. And some specific challenges of young people. What is it that young people these days are dealing with? Some of those things stay the same and some of them change over time. Some young people are still dealing with the same issues that, I was in high school. Some of the issues are much newer, especially with things like technology or how, COVID-19 has impacted schools, things like that. Those are not things I ever had to experience. And so having conversations around that can be really helpful. And lastly, family engagement. This one comes up a lot. Mentors really tend to struggle with this, and programs don't always do a great job of coaching them, especially if the program isn't explicitly, like the mentor isn't expected to do a lot of family engagement, but the reality of the relationship is they're going to have to engage with their mentee's family in some capacity. And it's one of those things that mentors really tend to struggle with for some reason. When we're thinking about training, I like to think of it in two separate boxes. The first one is the sort of administrative piece, right? What are our policies and procedures? Who do I call if there's an issue? What kind of paperwork do I need to be doing? What are our communication protocols? How often do I need to check in? How often do I need to talk to my mentee? All of these things. What is the matching and meeting process going to look like? Just the very administrative, program pieces. And on the other hand, we have that sort of programmatic, in the weeds training. So that's those young people engagement skills, stages of development, cultural competence and cultural humility. What does trauma look like in young people, working with families, all the things they need to be a good mentor. One way to think about it that I found helpful is, on one hand, you have the sort of training on the rules of the game. So, if we're playing a board game, these are the rules of Monopoly, right? This is how often you got to do this. This is the policies and procedures. This is who you talk to. And on the other hand, you have, how do you have fun and be successful playing the game? This is like strategy, how to communicate with each other, how to talk, right? So it's the rules of playing the game and the rules of how to actually have fun and be successful in the game. And we want to make sure we're doing both, because we want to make sure the mentors and mentees both feel equipped to understand the sort of program operations, how to address any issues, all of that stuff. But we also want to make sure we're digging deep into some of that work that we need to do to make sure they feel like they can be successful and enjoy being part of this process. Mentee orientation is really helpful too. We need to make sure they understand what's expected of them and properly prepared for the relationship. Especially from a trauma-informed perspective, we want to make sure that these young people are as equipped as possible in understanding what exactly it is that they're getting into and what it is that they're going to need to be able to navigate. So that's training. Let's talk through matching and initiating. So when we're doing matching with mentors and mentees, the two most important things that you're going to be able to match based on are characteristics and traits and personality. This is why interviews during the process, both for mentors and mentees, is so crucial, because you really want to get to know them as much as you can, so that way you can match them with people who kind of fit with their personality and their characteristics and traits. Interests and hobbies can be really helpful. So, if they're both into, I don't know, sports or books or gardening or whatever it is, those can be really helpful ways for them to connect. But ultimately, their personality and characteristics and traits are going to be more important. But it can be helpful to think through, or if they've shared personal experiences, the type of things that are really going to be able to connect them with each other. One thing that comes up a lot is sort of gender-based and race-based matching. I will say, a lot of the sort of research in general has kind of told us that matching across gender doesn't really matter. A lot of programs get really caught up in this for some reason. The exception being if your program is about, sort of those gender identities. So, mentoring to help young men develop confident, masculinity, or help young women navigate being a young woman, all of those types of things, then yes, you want to make sure you're incorporating that in part of your matching process. But as a rule, it really doesn't matter that much. The personality and characteristics and things like that are going to be so much more important. And it's the same sort of thing with sort of cross-racial matches. The outcomes end up being the same. There's some extra considerations for cross-racial or cross-gender matches. But, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter a ton. Again, the exception being if it's a program that's based on developing a strong sense of racial identity or ethnic identity based on a particular, identity group, like, you have a program that's for Latinx young men to develop strong, ethnic and cultural identities, then, you want to have mentors that can speak to that. But unless it's specifically part of your program, it's not all that important. Unless, and this is the exception to both those, it's specifically requested by, the mentee or their family. We want to make sure we can honor those requests as much as possible. So if, the mentee's family is like, hey, we'd really love to make sure that, my son is matched with someone from the same, he's a young Black man, and I think it'd be really important for him to be able to be matched with an older Black man to kind of help him navigate some of those things. Even if it's not your program's explicit focus, that could be important as well. So there's a couple of different ways to kind of make matches, the most common of which is having your staff choose, right? So you run the mentoring program, you have a list of mentors, a list of mentees, and you just kind of say, I think these two are going to be good together, these two are going to be good together. It works pretty well, especially if you've been doing it for a while. You can get a sense for these things. It's not a bad way to do matching. It's simple, it's efficient. A lot of programs do it for a reason. You can also do things where you have mentor and mentee choosing. I've worked with more programs recently, especially that are focusing on having the mentee choose. I found programs that use mentors choosing their mentees to be specifically only really be successful when it's like older mentees, like college age, and it's focused around like sort of professional type programs or programs in the workplace or things like that. That can be successful in that type of setting, but it takes a certain type of mindset for the mentee's perspective to be okay with all of that. I have seen more programs doing things around mentee choosing, especially as programs try to involve young people's voices more directly into their programming. This could mean having, an online list where the mentee says, this person sounds good, I want to meet with them. It could mean having some type of like, this gets into some of the mutual piece, where they'll do like a speed mentoring type thing, and then they're able to, so they meet a bunch of the mentors and mentees all kind of connect to each other, and then based on that, maybe the mentees get to kind of pick their mentors or rank them and get matched, or however they want to do it. I haven't seen too much of explicitly where parents and guardians choose the mentors or mentees, but a lot of programs do heavily incorporate their preferences, again, especially in terms of what type of background that they might be looking for. And activity and group-based matching, that's kind of what I was saying with the doing speed mentoring, things like that, doing some type of activity or a group activity, and then kind of filtering through the matches after that they kind of get to know each other in a group setting, then they kind of pair off. And that can kind of lead into, again, staff choosing, mentors, mentees, mutual. It can kind of be any one of those. But starting with, group activities where everyone gets to know each other a little bit first before matching. Again, I've seen programs like that, especially when working with older mentees, to be more successful. One thing that some programs have done is what's called youth-directed matching or youth-initiated mentoring. These are really helpful, I think, for a lot of young people. So what they do is, instead of recruiting mentors to come recruit your mentees, you work with the mentees to develop the skills and expertise to go out and find their own mentors. I like this model a lot, especially because it coaches young people on how to do that, later in life. I think it's a good sort of skill building way to approach developing your relationships and all of the kind of people that you're going to have to navigate as an adult. We still have to have some of these types of mentoring relationships, but we have to kind of go out and find them ourselves. And so it helps provide young people with some context to be able to start doing that, which I think is really powerful. And then we have the initiating, launching matches kind of phase. It's always good to start some type of structured, supported first meeting. This can be something fun. Could be, sometimes I've had programs pair it with the training and orientation. So you have mentors in one room, mentees in another room, doing their respective orientations and some training, and then coming together and doing activity together. So it all happens in one place. This is great for a few reasons. Helps reduce anxiety and help matches begin their relationship in a positive way, right? Doing icebreakers, breaking off a little bit of some of that anxiety can be really helpful. Again, you can make sure you're reviewing policies and setting expectations together. What programs I've worked with a lot will do is have a sort of physical mentoring contract of just like, an agreement of the expectations on both sides, and they both sign on to it and make that formal sort of agreement of like, all right, we met, we talked some, this is something we're both agreeing to embark on this relationship. So they both have some ownership over it. Helps outline, goals and activities, really helps mentors and mentees start to plan and think about those things, help lay out the next steps. And again, those statements of understanding. It can also be helpful to have family members be part of that as well, so they can sign off and so everyone's on the same page around what they're doing. All right, standard 5, we have monitoring and support. In my mind, this is one of the most important for a few reasons. One, it's the most important in the sense that this is where most issues with mentors and mentees and matches is going to be alleviated, because you're going to be able to provide monitoring and support and be able to catch red flags before they turn into real issues. I also think it's particularly important because in my experience, it's the first thing that gets kind of cut back on by programs with limited sort of staffing capacity and abilities. And, that is not a good combination, right? The thing that's most helpful in rooting out red flags and problem issues is also the thing that most programs skimp on when they're running low on capacity. And so it's really, really, really important to focus on this. So just a couple outlines and tips for this. It's not rocket science. It's just checking in with your mentors regularly. It's just checking in with the mentees and their families regularly and keeping tabs on what's happening. With site-based mentoring, it can be a little bit easier, but especially with community-based mentoring, where they're meeting on their own, it's really, really crucial to make sure that we're checking in with them as much as possible. There should be some type of clear process for checking in, seeking feedback, handling problems. That means both a clear process for you checking in with them, as well as a pipeline up to you to be able to elevate issues. Communicating regularly with them, we encourage at least monthly, if not bi-monthly. You can help them find ways to reach goals. So if a mentor is really struggling with helping their mentee reach a goal, we can help them troubleshoot strategies and solutions. We can address any concerns and manage expectations. A lot of mentors will get really frustrated during their mentoring experience because they feel like they're not really having an impact. But what we know about mentoring is that the impact is often not felt for quite some time after the relationship. And so helping them manage those expectations around what type of impact they're going to have is going to be really helpful in keeping that mentor engaged and feeling like they're making a difference and stopping them from, perhaps leaving the program early. It can be really great to bring mentors together for peer support during this. Making sure that they are, communicating with each other and sharing those sort of shared frustrations as well as solutions. Ongoing training is really important as well. We'll do that training at the beginning, but at that point, it's still very abstract. They haven't done it yet. Once they've been mentoring for a little while, you could deliver the same training again, and it's going to just hit totally different because they're going to have context and examples and things like that to really dig into and understand the difference between what they were hearing before and what they're hearing now. Making sure you're documenting all contacts and attempts to check in with them. Again, you want to make sure that for liability purposes, as well as if you're continually trying to check in with your mentors and they're just continually blowing you off, that might not be a mentor who's a good fit for your program anymore. It also provides opportunities to recognize mentors and mentees who are doing particularly great jobs. We want to be able to elevate those. Spotting red flags is, I think, one of the biggest parts of it. I touched on it before, but if someone's having these issues and you're providing feedback, you're providing support, and they're just not hearing you, they're not changing anything, they're, saying like, yeah, I know what's right, I know it's good here. Those are going to be issues you're going to, really run into and want to keep tabs on here. The majority of harm that comes to young people as part of a mentoring program is not, again, those sort of that predator who, finagles their way into your program to get access to unsupervised young people. It's well-meaning adults who come in as mentors who just don't have great boundaries and push those boundaries, and something bad happens because of that. They get too close and they cross too many boundaries. They're giving gifts and money and all this stuff to their family, and they're crossing that boundary too much, and then we have to pull them back, and that causes a rift. Or you say don't put a mentee in your car, and they do, and they get in a car accident. Things like this happen. And so when you see those red flags during the supervision and monitoring section of the program and of the mentor-mentee match, that's when it's absolutely crucial to really pull them back and say, listen, this is not where we want to be right now. Lastly, we have closure. So why does mentoring end? A mentor-mentee is just not compatible. You match them together. You thought it was a great fit. Just turns out it wasn't. Mentor-mentee leaves the program. This could be, voluntary. They leave because they had to move, or they just don't have the time commitment they thought they did, so they leave out of the program. Things like that. Individual life circumstances, again, like moving, job situation, things like that. For some programs, the mentee might reach that sort of level of self-sufficiency that don't need the mentor, especially programs that are really built across many, many years of matching together. Or the program has a set timeline for aging out of it too as well. So program, when they graduate high school or turn 18 or 16 or whatever it is, the program just sort of ends, or it's a 12-month program. So we want to make sure that closure is coordinated with the program manager. There needs to be that point person at the top who is able to, dig in and manage all of these relationships and complex sort of things that are happening. You want to make sure parent guardian is notified, especially in the event of unanticipated closure. So if something's happening at the wrong time, not at the sort of planned end of match closure, then we want to make sure we're getting the parent guardian, whoever the adult in their life is, on the same page as quickly as possible. And you want to make sure that you all are able to tell the mentee in some way that's going to be the right time. We don't want to make sure we don't tell them too far ahead of time if the mentor is moving, because then it just becomes can put strain on the relationship. The mentee starts to distance themselves a little prematurely in anticipation of the mentor leaving. But we also don't want to wait till too long so that they feel it's more abrupt. So spending time with the program manager, the mentor, and the parent guardian can be really helpful. And again, this is when those sort of life circumstances come in. So you decide on end date and establish that realistic timeline of when can this person phase out of this program. Exit interviews are really helpful, as well as having some type of events leading up to that termination. This is true even for planned, if your program, say, runs over a 12-month period or whatever it is, you want to make sure you're spending time leading up to that closure, talking to those mentors about how to have conversations with the mentees around closure of the relationship ending. I think in general, humans are just really bad at saying goodbye. And so our job as the program manager is to really coach the mentor on feeling comfortable and confident and talking to the mentee and being like, hey, we only got a month or so left in our time together. We only have a few months left in our time together, whatever it is. How are you feeling about that? Because the last thing we want to do is have it be like their last session together and the mentor just shows up and then it's just like, okay, well, all right, well, that was fun. And I guess let's see you another time. Because you want to make sure that they have that space to process. Encouraging personal feelings, identifying those emotions, especially on the mentee side, but on the mentor side as well. They're going to be struggling with this. Grief, denial, resentment, all of these things are very real. We want to make sure that mentees' previous losses are kind of in our back of our head. If this is a mentee who's experienced trauma and loss, or had sort of negative relationships with people leaving, it can be important to really be aware of that. We want to make sure those feelings are all validated. The mentoring relationship can be a really important tool for young people to get modeled of what does healthy relationship closure look like. How does this mentee start to fade out? This mentoring relationship start to phase out, especially for young people whose experience of adult leaving their lives have always been sort of this leaving as this tragedy. This is a bad thing. But we can instead have a conversation with them around how people coming in and out of our lives is a natural part of the human experience. We all have people that we were friends with at one point in our life, and now we're not really anymore. Not because anything bad happened, we just sort of grew apart or we didn't need each other anymore, and that's okay. And so the mentoring relationship can be a really valuable tool in modeling that for young people who don't have that experience in their own lives. We also want to celebrate, especially if they're leaving mentors and mentees on a really positive note. We want to make sure the mentor understands the impact they're having on their mentee, as well as the mentee being able to articulate how important this experience was for them in terms of their ability to process their own feelings. So what was their favorite day? Pick a location or experience to share together. Create the sort of sense, space, and place for positive closure. And so this could be something the matches can do on their own, or it could be something that you do as a program or at a graduation, end of the year ceremony, things like that. But some type of celebration at the end of the match is really important. As well as thanking you. Remember, role modeling the positive goodbye. What types of things are you going to remember? What gifts are you going to take with you? Maybe a thank you note, things like that. And helping them process the loss, I think is really important as well, to spend time exploring and these new options of what a relationship might look like. Closure can also just be, renegotiating a relationship. It doesn't have to just be the end of it. They might be leaving the program, but they're still going to stay in touch in some way, and that's okay. And so they're renegotiating how they want to have a relationship with each other. And so we want to make sure that, the closure is both functional and well-timed. We want to have process, and we want to make sure that it's timed well. And make sure as you're writing your policies and procedures, you're having one both for anticipated and unanticipated closure. What is the process going to be when your program comes to an end, or a mentee ages out of your program, or whatever it is? There's this sort of anticipated natural closure. And then if there's unanticipated closure, what processes are you going to have in place to support that transition, either to a new mentor or out of the program, or however you want to address it? And then lastly, for the last few minutes we're here, we'll just talk about evaluation. I only have a few minutes. As we're finishing up, I will let you know on our website, we have links to all of our previously recorded webinars, and there is a in-depth webinar on each one of the elements of effective practice. So we spend an hour on just recruitment, just screening, just training, just evaluation. So if you want to dig deeper on any particular one of those, please go in and watch those, because this is really more of an overview. Evaluation is really important for a few reasons. One, you want to be able to articulate growth over time, and then you want to have some type of being able to show your program efficacy, right? And so having some type of pre-post test is a really valuable way to do that. Academics, family relations, positive sense of future, exposure to new experiences, these are all metrics that you can really incorporate. You want to put it into context of some type of theory of change. So what is your program's theory of change? And it's exactly what it sounds like, right? Like, what are you saying your program is doing and having impact on young people? So this is an example from a community organization called Align, which you may be familiar with. And so they're really focused on community organizing to move towards an extraction economy to a living economy. And they believe using these strategies, moving into different actions, will create this impact, which will lead to their vision. And so for mentoring programs, sometimes what this looks like is, hey, we have young people plus increased social capital plus advocacy for inclusive places is a diverse and successful workforce. That's our theory of change, that if we take these different pieces and put them together, then we're going to end up with our vision, which is a diverse and successful workforce. On the other hand, sometimes programs will have things like, well, if we take a young person and an adult, and we put them together, then we just think good things are going to happen. And that's not a theory of change, right? That's not what it is. And you're doing more than that if you're running a mentoring program. This is just our opportunity to articulate it. Particularly too, with a lot of the sort of racial realities of mentoring programs we talked about earlier, a lot of mentoring programs, their theory of change is just, if we take these young people of color and bring them in closer proximity to white people in white spaces, then they're going to have successful outcomes. And again, that's a problematic kind of way to approach our work as well. And so taking that time to think about, what is our theory of change and what do we believe that we're doing? And so ultimately, when we're thinking about our evaluation and measurements, we want to take that theory of change, tell that story. How are we taking them from point A to point B? And what do we need to measure? And what type of metrics do we need to have in place to know that we're taking people from point A to point B? And they should be both qualitative and quantitative, right? They should both be numbers and stories. Because if it's just numbers and data, it's going to be really boring and not going to tell much of a story. But if it's just qualitative, if it's just, narratives and testimonials and anecdotal evidence, then that's not really compelling in terms of being able to show the impact either. But when you marry them together into a balanced way of telling a story of how we're describing our impact, then that's going to be much more successful. So just to recap briefly, thinking about your design, you want to have a management plan that includes risk management, how to recruit, screen, and train mentors and make those matches, match support and relationship coaching. And that's it. I'm going to share now quickly, just in our last couple of minutes together, because I went a little bit longer than I meant to. Just a few resources for you. So the first one, and this is our website, mentornewyork.org. And if you go over to our work, into our webinars and workshops, presumably this is how you registered for this today, or maybe not. But if you go down here to past webinars, it will show you the videos of all of our previous webinars. And so, as I said, there are some around specifically screening, training, as well as some of those EAP supplements and lots of great content. So I highly recommend digging in through these. We also have our racial equity framework. So if your program is thinking about how are we doing a better job of doing mentoring work for the racial equity frame, this is a great tool for that. And again, happy to talk through this with you more specifically. This is our national office's website. It's mentoring.org. And if you go up to the what we do, they just redid this, so I'm still trying to learn it again. But elements of effective practice for mentoring here. You can download all of the research and best practices, as well as those supplements. And if you keep scrolling down towards the bottom here, this is my favorite part of this website, is where it says additional tools here. In both English and Spanish, these are 4 zip drop files with a bunch of templates and resources that you can use for your program for free. They're really, really great tools. I can't recommend these enough. And the last thing I'll share with you is what we call the National Mentoring Resource Center. This is 2 things. The first one is some really great resources, particularly here if you want to think about logic models and theories of change for your program. If you want to dig into that, I highly recommend it, as well as the Measurement Guidance Toolkit. So this has a bunch of free to use pre and post tests that you can use to develop certain, evaluate certain parts of your program. And so here's one to do pro-social behavior, and it's available with no charge here. The last thing I'll point to on here as well is if you go to the home page at the bottom, they just redid this website too, so I'm still trying to, here it is. You can request no-cost technical assistance. You can access to us as no-cost consultants and technical assistance providers to you. It's at no cost to you if you qualify and do the application. And I recommend doing that if you want some more specific help for your program. So I'm going to put my email address into the chat here again. And it should be right there as well. And we'll send you a follow-up with a link to these copy of these slides as well sometime over the next few days. And if you do have any questions between now and then, please don't hesitate to let me know through an email or any thoughts that you have. I appreciate your time today. I'm going to go ahead and close off, but please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or thoughts that you have. And again, I appreciate you for taking time out on your Wednesday afternoon for this, and hopefully it was useful for you. Enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you again.